In episode 6 of the Prep Podcast, we welcome Doug Kechijian. Doug offers some great experiential knowledge around the differences between his military education and what I would call his more academic education as a physical therapist. And I wanted him to compare and contrast those two different experiences and perhaps give us some ideas on how we can move forward with our own education, particularly during all of the challenges we've experienced during a global pandemic and how things will evolve as we look to the future. So I hope you'll enjoy our discussion with Doug Kechijian. All right, Doug Kechijian, thank you for jumping on. I had the pleasure of speaking with you on many occasions, and I see this as no different in terms of the value you bring. And as I've been talking to more and more people in this sort of new format podcast of mine, I want to get everybody's opinion on, what does education look like? Because, I just sent my kids off to school. They're going for like 2 hours a day in a smaller group setting, and they're going to come back and it's up to them to kind of study stuff on their own. And I think a lot of us are feeling that way to some degree, where we can't necessarily have, the traditional forms of like meeting in groups and sharing ideas and bouncing stuff off each other. So now we're looking at different ways to do that. So it is a bit of a pivoting point right now in terms of education. And I think of, places like universities, colleges, and are they going to rethink it? Like I have my own courses as well as you do, and I'm trying to figure out what that level of engagement can be, so that we capture those people's enthusiasm, motivation around learning. I don't know if the universities are seeing it that way, but I want to reflect back on what were some of the key things about your education that were important and made a huge difference, and then what are some of the things that we can improve, and we can start as far back as you want. But what were some of the first things, like when you thought about, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to get into physical therapy and areas of performance. What were some of the first steps that you took to make that happen?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on, Derek. And I think it's an interesting and exciting question just because education is obviously changing a great deal right now. And, it obviously, it depends on what kind of education you're talking about. I mean, and I'm going to kind of bounce around here because there's a lot of stuff that you brought up that I think really warrants some discussion. But so as far as like COVID, right? Like a lot of the things that are going on now are being done out of necessity. But I think that just like we're seeing with the workplace, like with remote work and stuff like that, it was inevitable that at some point people were going to be working more remotely because why, when you have an internet connection and you have self-motivated professionals, do you need people to be constantly micromanaged in an office, right? Now, having, like an adult work from home, I don't think is the same as having a first grader do school from home, right? Like I think that once you get to a certain age and you're socialized and you sort of like have learned how to learn, whatever that looks like, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, then I think the need for in-person learning goes way down, at least if it's more of like a theoretical type thing. So I feel bad for the kids that, especially the younger ones that aren't going to school and are doing it virtually because they're not being socialized. And a lot of the education, I think, at that age isn't so much learning how to do math, although that's part of it. It's learning how to interact with other children and how to learn boundaries and socialization. And a lot of them aren't getting that. Now, I think it's much different if you're 18 to 22 and you're going to university. I think that just like with the workforce, university education was going to change whether COVID happened or not. And now I think that the COVID process is expediting it. And I think that it's forcing a lot of people to question, what is the value of an education? I mean, some of the private schools in New York, or not in New York, in the United States are $70,000 a year in US dollars. And when you think about really the return on investment, like what are you really getting? Is the education worth the 70 grand a year? Or is it the fact that like you have a degree from a prestigious university, it's granting you access to a network? I don't think you're paying 70 grand a year for an education. I think you can get, in some cases, an education for way less money, even for free on the internet, but you're paying for kind of for access and a network. And if the gatekeepers want to maintain that, there probably is a way to maintain that, because unless you can create the same level of kind of prestige and build those same connections at a much cheaper price point, it's going to be hard to replace that. But if we're talking purely about education, I think the university in a lot of ways is, I don't want to say obsolete, but I think it's a little bit of a scam they're running. And I hope that, I just hope that when it comes to education, there's competition and a lot of different models are allowed to, we're running like these parallel experiments, and then kind of the market and people can decide what's good and what's not. But as happens in a lot of fields, the people and the organizations that are very entrenched tend to block out competition and don't allow those parallel experiments to be run. And I think that, like, it's not in a university's best interest to have low cost educational models and decentralized educational platforms. So they're probably going to do the best they can to say, hey, like, if you don't go to our school, you're not going to get a great education. It's going to make you not as prepared for the workforce, all these things. And I don't think that universities prepare people for the workforce in a lot of ways. And it's just like what happens in our field of performance and rehabilitation. There's a little bit of, there can be a bit of a hierarchy sometimes. So the physicians will say, hey, we don't want the physios doing this. And the physios will say, we don't want the coaches doing manual therapy because it's dangerous. And frankly, almost the overwhelming majority of the time, when one profession says that somebody else doing something is unsafe, it's not because it's unsafe, it's because they don't want a threat to their market share. And so universities are no different. And even when it comes to our field, I want competition. Like, I hope that, because the end user, the athlete or the consumer of healthcare, I hope that they have various providers they can choose from, whether it's a physio, an athletic trainer, even a personal trainer or a strength coach, because the more people are competing, it forces everyone else to be better, but no one really likes competition. So that's a little bit of the soapbox on kind of like where education is going. I think we need competition, and it's not clear that what we've done traditionally is the quote unquote best. But kind of backtracking to kind of my education as like a physio, I would backtrack even further and say, like, a lot of like the lens through which I look at education and training was shaped by my military experience, where like I did search and rescue for the Air Force, worked with various units in the special operations community, and there wasn't a lot of room for false confidence. Like, sometimes on the deployments that I went on, I would be farmed out to like an assault team to work as their like medic and technical rescue advisor. And I was in some cases, like one of maybe two medical providers like on the mission. So I couldn't just like not know my job and say, well, I'm going to outsource this or delegate it to somebody else. Like, I mean, even in a hospital, and I'm not saying that like I was trained to the same level as somebody that worked, like a physician in the hospital, because I wasn't. But, even in a hospital, like, you have, for the most part, unlimited resources and there's delegation of responsibility. For what I did, I wasn't held to the same standard medically as what like a PA or a physician would be in an emergency room, but I was expected to do the basics very, very well, and there was nobody else really to do them. And so our training reflected the reality on the ground, where it was very hands-on and very practical. And yes, we did get some theory, but we didn't get bogged down with theory, because ultimately it's like, yeah, it's great if you can, recite the coagulation cascade in a PowerPoint presentation, but if someone gets shot and is splurting blood in front of you, what matters is, can you stop the bleed, not whether you can recite the coagulation cascade. It's kind of like in our field, right? Like, it's great if you know the Krebs cycle and energy systems, but if you don't know how to program for the athlete, the conditioning for the athlete you're working with, the biochemistry isn't that important. So I think a lot of times people will hide behind, well, like, you have to know the biochemistry to work with an athlete, but like, you kind of really don't, because most people just, they learn it and they forget it. And I would even go back to like I am presumably applying anatomy every time I work with an athlete or a patient. But if I had to take my anatomy practical from the first semester of physical therapy school, I would probably fail it, because for that test, they would stick a flag in a cadaver, and I had to, name to the exact letter, the muscle, blood vessel, nerve. A lot of times I had to like recite like the exact, where exactly on the bone does it attach with the proper nomenclature. And like, I don't do that now because I don't have to. I have to apply that anatomy. And I'm sure, like, I think that, yeah, taking an anatomy course is necessary to do what I do. But I don't think that it's necessary to memorize it and regurgitate it in the depth that I had to do it. It's kind of part of that rite of passage. And I think a lot of times we just do things because it's always been done that way. So it's like, yes, anatomy is important. Therefore, we've got to really, really learn it. But what does learning look like? I don't know if reciting the names off of a cadaver is the kind of learning that we're actually after, but it's just what we've done. So we do it. So as far as the military went, it was like very, very hands-on. I mean, the stuff that like, and it's funny. I could probably send you the article if you want it for your notes. But like, I went to a medical course a couple of times in the military where like we literally inserted Foley catheters into each other. In some cases, you know, depending on like if somebody consented to it, they would actually give people different drugs that you would use, you know, like on a mission to actually see what the side effects are. Because like if you've never given somebody ketamine, you won't know that having them like hallucinate and do weird things is actually a side effect of the drug. It doesn't mean that they're actually like having an adverse reaction to it. It's to be expected, right? But sometimes, like, you know, if you look at a PowerPoint slide or look at a drug guide, and it's like, oh, here are the side effects. Until you've actually like seen that side effect or watched a person go through it, you don't know what's normal. And having that kind of emotional experience of learning, of watching somebody have this reaction to a drug, is much more profound than reading about it on a slide or answering a multiple choice test about it. And you know, they did, you know, the training that I did in these courses was very, very realistic. I'll say that. And it actually, the training got shut down because what happened was, as with anything, the people that were running the training, I think, got a little bit greedy. And instead of keeping it to like very, very, you know, specialized medical providers in the military, they opened it up to more and more people in the military. They actually opened it up to military medical students, people in a lot of cases who, you know, were civilians a couple of weeks before they took the course, and then they enlisted in the military, became like military medical students with a commitment to the military. But because they don't know, like, hey, when you're a medical provider in the military, even a, you know, whether it's a doctor or a medic, sometimes like you're so under resourced that you have to be able to do everything, and there's no room for false confidence in training. And the training that we went through reflected that. But because these military medical students had no context for what was going on, they actually, some of them complained about how realistic the training was, and you know, they ended up shutting down that training. The person who ran it was disbarred, excuse me, or like I think might have had his license suspended in the state that he worked in. And I had taken that course like 3 or 4 times, and not once did I find it to be unprofessional. I found it to be more like realistic. And having gone on various missions and seen what you're responsible for, I was like, this is exactly what we need. But the people who didn't have that context thought that it was like over the edge. Like one of the things that they did was they did a perfusion lab, basically to like show what are the various forms of hydration, and you know what are the better and worse ways to hydrate somebody like in a, you know, an intense or, you know, heat type climate on a military mission. So what they didn't force anyone to do it, but they encouraged people to do the day before the hydration lab was, they said, okay, we want you to basically get as drunk and as hungover as you can. You know, don't try not to drink too much water. Like try not to rehydrate so we can see like what works with this lab. And again, they didn't stick a gun to your head and tell you to do it, but it's military people. A lot of them like to drink. They didn't need an excuse to go out and, you know, and get hungover. So they would take these hungover people. One group would get pure IV fluid. They weren't allowed to drink anything, just IV fluid. One group was only allowed to drink water. One group was only allowed to drink Gatorade. And then one group was only allowed to drink what's called oral rehydration salts, which is basically the kind of like the adult equivalent of Pedialyte, where they basically try to take the electrolyte composition of sweat, and you're basically just drinking that. So you're getting water fluids and the electrolytes to the best extent possible to mimic the electrolyte characteristics of sweat. So we ran the experiment, and basically what they proved was that the oral rehydration salt was the best, you know, air quotes form of hydration, because that's what mimics sweat. And even though with an IV you can get fluids into people very quickly, like your body didn't evolve to get fluid intravenously, it evolved to get it orally. So what happens with IV fluid is you can slam a lot of fluid directly into the blood, into the venous circulation, and bypass your digestive system. But because that it's going in so fast, and because um, the electrolyte composition of that IV fluid doesn't match what's going on in the extracellular space, what ends up happening is that extracellular space ends up pulling fluid from the blood vessels. And people who like just slam a lot of IV fluid in this lab ended up getting really puffy, and they would kind of get like tissue swelling. And they were doing like 3,000 cc's of IV fluid. So again, they're trying to show what happens at the extremes. And for a healthy person, it's safe to take that much fluid through an IV, but you could actually see they would get a little bit puffy. And the water people, if you drink too much water, they didn't do it to a dangerous extent, but if you drink too much water, you can get what's called hyponatremia, which is kind of like water toxicity. Again, they didn't drink enough water to get that, but if you're really dehydrated and you've lost electrolytes through sweat, water is actually not the best form of hydration. And then the Gatorade group, because Gatorade doesn't match the electrolyte composition of sweat, and also has some sugars in it. The people who drank a lot of the Gatorade actually ended up getting some GI distress and some like stomach issues. So again, yes, you could look at a PowerPoint presentation and see like, okay, like it makes sense that if you're sweating and you're in like an intense heat climate, the best thing to do is to try to mimic the composition of sweat orally and replace that. But when you watch, the IV fluid people getting puffy, and the Gatorade people going to the bathroom and getting diarrhea, and the water people feeling a little bit sick, and the oral rehydration salt group feeling great, it's like that's a profound experience that you never forget. So there's always this emotional component to learning, and you learn better like anything else, just like with physical training, when you're under the right amount of stress. Too much stress, you're not uncomfortable enough, your body doesn't adapt. Too little stress, i.e. PowerPoint, you don't have that kind of like that good dose of stress for learning. So learning should be hard. And I think a lot of times like we make learning way too easy. So that was kind of my context. Obviously I went to college before that, but then going to physical therapy school after that, like in many cases, I was underwhelmed by the experience, because I thought the military was really good about getting you to do what you're responsible for doing in a very short amount of time, because the training was very, very hands-on and applied, and there was that stress and that emotional component to it. And then I for the most part, I felt like the classroom portion of physical therapy school, and again, it's classrooms, that's what it's designed to be, was in some cases overly theoretical, and they would test us on things that were kind of what I thought were esoteric and things that you would just forget after the test. The experiences that I got the most out of in physical therapy school were my internships. And I think that any medical field is going to be ultimately like I think a craftsman first. And you could even ask a surgeon, like, what was the most useful part of your medical education? They would all say it was the residency and fellowship. And how does the residency and fellowship works? It works if you're doing surgery, like maybe for the first 6 months or a year, you're not allowed to touch somebody. All you do is you just watch other surgeons do surgery, and they're explaining to you what they're seeing, what they're looking at. So even though there's a theoretical component to that, you're getting it in context. You're getting it in here's the theory as it applies to the surgery that I'm doing right in front of you. And then you might scrub in, and then you might do like kind of you might just do like the suturing part, and you might not be the one repairing the ACL in an ACL surgery, but you're just watching a lot of surgeries, and you're gradually ramping up your exposure until you're doing the surgery yourself, and you're just adding degrees of stress and complexity under the eyes of a mentor. So I still think that apprenticeship model in an applied field like medicine or coaching is the best way to learn. Not to say that theory is not important, but I think that we overdo it with theory. And a lot of times, like frankly, theory is the easiest thing to do, and it's the easiest way to make money, because you can get a bunch of people in a classroom, you could charge them $70,000 a year for it, and it's like that's very, very scalable. It doesn't mean that it's the best way to learn, right? So for me, I'm not dismissing the role of the classroom, but I learned the most in physical therapy school by seeking out the right mentor. So I was fortunate to go to a program that actually let me kind of pick the people that I wanted to intern with. There were some requirements, like I had to do, one internship in a hospital, but then beyond that, I could pretty much pick whatever I wanted to do. So I picked people that were kind of doing the things that I envisioned myself wanting to do from a practice standpoint. And that's where I learned the most, was just by having good mentors, that like apprenticeship model. And I mean, even though it might seem antiquated and traditional and old school, I still think that it's the best way to learn in an applied field. And I mean, I'm not in a field that's more theoretical. So I suppose there are instances where like having a more theoretical type education or more of a theoretical emphasis is better. But I think that for the audience, for the most part that's listening to this, I still think apprenticeship and mentorship, internship is the way to go. And I mean, just like even with, I'm a physical therapist, but I have a strength and conditioning background, and I've done internships in that too. And I learned way more in my strength and conditioning internships watching good coaches than I ever did by reading an exercise physiology textbook or taking an exercise physiology test, right? So hopefully there's a point where, I think where education probably should go is, especially at the university and the graduate level, is like for physical therapy education as an example, save the in-person stuff for the things that really need to be done in person. So like, yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, it's probably better if I'm getting a lecture with a teacher 10 feet away than a teacher on the internet. But from a scalability standpoint, if you can save somebody tens of thousands of dollars a year by doing that part, online or on YouTube, where that institution doesn't have this huge overhead and infrastructure to support, I personally would be willing to pay less to get a little bit of a less ideal educational experience from a lecture standpoint, but then have people physically come in for the hands-on labs, the practical application. And so I think that's where probably education, at least from like a medical standpoint, is going. At the university level, I still think that a lot of why people go to college is, even though it's not like first grade, is to socialize, because now even though you're away from home kind of for the first time of your life. And I think there's a learning component from an individual standpoint that occurs when you're like away from your parents and you're a little bit more responsible for yourself. And you're not getting that if you're in your parents' basement or in your bedroom in your parents' house watching a Zoom lecture on physics or on calculus. But I think that hybrid is probably where all this stuff is going. And even for me personally, like now I'm at the point where like having a family and a child, and we've talked about this, like it's really hard for me to take an entire weekend to go to a Con Ed course, even though I enjoy doing it. But so I'm really digging these self-paced, cloud-based courses, and I don't think it's going to make hands-on education obsolete, because even I've done courses with you where like I've actually watched you coach athletes. It was essentially a mentorship, and I found that to be very valuable. And I don't think that can be totally duplicated online. Like even watching you or a coach like you coach and cue people, online, like where like if you filmed a session of you coaching an athlete, I still think that's better than watching a PowerPoint, but it probably isn't as good as you being there live and just like seeing that athlete in real time. So I think that we all need to figure out like how to take, advantage, totally exploit like the best of in-person learning, the best of distance-based learning, and try to make that like really scalable. And I think that's where the field is going.
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking as you were talking and going, you answered all the questions, but certainly when I thought about your applied learning in the military, and then now going back to the classroom for physical therapy, and was that difficult? Was that like, hey, I want to start doing stuff, and you got me sitting in this classroom, but and then I started thinking about, is there a place for that in terms of like, earning your stripes, in terms of having some patience and waiting for that to come. Because I was talking to somebody else about, brought up my turntable, and now I'm listening to vinyl records, and I have to actually put the needle on the record. I play through the entire side, and some of those songs I probably don't want to necessarily listen to, but I will. Like, so there's a patience component, and just being present, that I'm starting to get reacquainted with in listening to music. Whereas, if you have a phone or an iPod or something, you can shuffle through everything you don't like and filter it out and make your own playlist. So is there a place in education and learning to kind of build that and build that patience and build that tolerance? Do you think there is, or do you think we should just get right
I
to
mean,
it?
there's only so much you can rush, right? Like you're only capable of retaining and learning so much at once. And sometimes like with digital learning, you have so much information at your disposal that it's very easy to kind of jump around like a squirrel and not actually take time to digest. But I mean, so I agree with you. Like that's something that needs to be addressed. But the flip side of it is, I also think that a lot of times, like school and university is just it's a rite of passage because it's very easy to just like give someone a multiple choice test and have that be like how you evaluate talent. I think that frankly in a lot of fields, including like let's say like investment banks in New York City, for the most part they don't have their own like internal metrics or their own internal way of identifying talent. They outsource it to universities. So it's like, oh, this person went to this school, they must be good. Like if you don't go to a certain school, you don't have a certain GRE score, like you don't even get an interview. And then they interview you, and then based on that, they make a subjective determination of kind of like whether you should work there or not. But the ideal scenario, right, which is hard to do, is if you want to select an investment banker who's relatively untrained, you would give them some form of remedial training that didn't take too long, it wasn't that resource intensive, and have all of your candidates go through that exact same program, that exact same training, and then give people scenarios that actually mimic the kind of things that you want them to do. So the problem is like, because it's easy to say, okay, like we're gonna outsource our talent ID to Harvard or an Ivy League school. That's kind of what people do, and that's what universities are. Is people just rely on the fact that, well, like this kind of works. We've been doing it for a long time, and I think it's a way for a lot of organizations and companies, teams to sort of evade responsibility for actually figuring out what's important. And it's always going to be imperfect. I mean, the military does that too. Like in the job that I was in, they're not going to take an untrained person. You can't take an untrained person, have them parachute out of an airplane, go through like some complex tactical and medical scenario and evaluate them on that because they haven't been trained to do it. So they find imperfect proxies for the qualities they want to select. They want to select people that are trainable, that work well as a team, that have kind of the physical and psychological ability to withstand stress. So they basically just like run you into the ground, sleep deprive you, do all these things, and then put you through like a pretty rigorous academic curriculum to try to figure out if it's worth investing the money in you to train you to do what they want you to do. So it's never going to be perfect. But I think that like a lot of times, there's this academic rite of passage where like you have to learn organic chemistry to be a doctor, and almost any doctor will tell you that it has zero application to being a doctor. Like unless you want to be a chemist or you want to work in a very specific field of microbiology, organic chemistry and the Krebs cycle probably has very little carryover to what you're doing. So I think that learning needs to be slow and deliberate and patient, but as long as you're being deliberate about the right things and not just doing things because they're hard and it's just like that's what we've always done. I think a lot of times now, like we make people be patient about things that don't really matter that much, but they're hard, and it's just a way to kind of like to weed people out. But I think a lot of times you're weeding out the wrong people because you're identifying talent based on things that don't matter that much. And typically in education and academia, it's just bombarding people with a lot of material with no context and then having them regurgitate on a test. And that's why like people retain the most information from apprenticeship, internship, because there's actually context to what you're learning. Like when you're in physical therapy school or medical school and you learn about like this disease process, if you haven't actually seen someone who has it, then it's really hard to appreciate why it matters. I mean, and I'll give you an example. Like when I learned about dementia and Alzheimer's in my neuro course in PT school, it didn't matter because at the time I was like in my late 20s and I didn't know anybody who had that. And so it was an abstraction. I learned way more by having when my father had advanced dementia and Alzheimer's than I ever learned and yeah, granted, like in my, my course in physical therapy school is like, I could tell you, on an MRI, like what's wrong, what's quote unquote wrong with somebody who has these disease processes, and I could maybe like regurgitate the neurophysiology of it, but I was worthless from like an application standpoint. Like having, you know, partially helped taking care of a parent who had that, like from a practical standpoint, it was just leaps and bounds above anything I could have gotten in a classroom. And because I had the context, like I had a loved one who was had this disease process that I watched kind of take away his capacity to do physical and cognitive things. And that was just way more profound from a learning experience. And I don't think I would have needed like my father to have gotten that, to have appreciated the difference between the classroom and the practical application. I could have just like, hey, instead of doing a PowerPoint today, like we're gonna have you go to a nursing home and just follow somebody around who has dementia. And I would have been like, okay, like I get it, you know. But I think a lot of times, and there is a business to this, like universities have to justify their existence. And when you get into like really, really esoteric theory, there's no limit to how many years you can do that. So I think we should always be questioning like, how do we make things shorter? Like, does medical school have to be 4 years? Does physical therapy school have to be 3 years? And I think if you really audit a lot of these programs, the answer is probably it could be shorter, give people what they need so that they're not like a danger to themselves or somebody else when they go to their internships, but then try to get people into the clinic or on an internship as quickly as possible, because that's where the real learning begins. And then if you want to hold people accountable for academic theoretical information, do it when they're actually applying it, because they'll retain it a lot better. So I think we need to hold people accountable for information to make sure that they're actually like fit to do a particular job. But I don't know if how we're doing it now is the best way, because I think a lot of times, again, it's just like very esoteric. And what you're really doing is it's selection bias. Like you're picking people who have the motivation and the drive to study the material and regurgitate it on the test. And a lot of times, because people who are willing to do that oftentimes have the qualities you want, but you're not like apples to apples, one to one, directly selecting for what it is you care about. You're selecting for somebody who has the motivation and the tenacity to basically go through academic hazing. Same thing in the military, right? Like I went through basically physical hazing in the military, you know, responsibly and systematically applied, because they can't take an untrained person and send them to Afghanistan to do a mission and audit them. But so again, none of this is ever going to be perfect, but I think that we probably could do a better job of trying to find more realistic ways of evaluating talent and selecting people than we do now. Because right now it just tends to be academic hazing, and it's like, okay, we're good, we did our job, but like, did you really, you know? And you don't know until these people are working in the quote unquote real world. And I think we often see a disconnect between people that do well in these very like structured academic environments, and then people who like actually have to coach or actually have to treat patients.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like I remember you telling me about, all of this, army or military type training, and it was mainly a screening filtering process. It wasn't necessarily like this is what you're gonna use when you go on a mission. And I started thinking about that with school. Is it just a filtering screening process with a lot of junk content, that may not apply? And do we have to have that 4 year degree when maybe there's a quicker way to do that filtering process and get them a bit of knowledge? And then I started thinking about my own in-person courses, and now I have a digital version. um like you said, why don't I just send people the virtual one, and then we get together and do just practical whenever we meet. There's no PowerPoint slides, it's just all hands on, practical setting stuff. So do you think that would become more prevalent in conventional education, that they're going to start thinking that way, and like, hey, we got all these buildings and all these offices and classrooms, that's pretty expensive to maintain and build? Do you think that's going to be a change moving forward?
I think it could. I mean, I think the people that are already entrenched and like have high endowments don't have a lot of incentive to want to change. But as like as an upstart, like if you were trying to start a university now, that's probably where they're all the new ones are going to go. Because I think what you're going to have probably is you're going to have like the very, very quote unquote elite institutions that don't really have to change because they can live off their reputation from the last 200 years. And then you're going to have basically these hybrid models. But right, and you can justify like if you go to this a very prestigious university and it gets you, you know, a job that pays you a couple $100,000 after a few years, then that investment was worth it, presumably. I think where it's not worth it from an ROI standpoint is if you go to because a lot of schools that frankly aren't that good are also $70,000 a year, and then you don't you're not getting a great job when you graduate. So what's the point of that? I mean, so I think that you're gonna cut out these schools that like are kind of in the middle where they have the same kind of price point and are as resource intensive as the quote unquote elite schools, but they don't deliver the same ROI. So then it's like if you can't get into one of these really, really good schools, then you probably are better off going to a school that has a much lower price point where, your earning potential is no different than what it would be if you went to a $70,000 a year school, but it wasn't quite as good and didn't have the same network as like the quote unquote elite ones. And then just to backtrack on like the military thing, like when it comes to selection, the military is kind of doing these like imperfect training, hazing type things. But once they select you for the job you want, then they do a really good job of training. And that's where I think that like academic institutions, even like civilian, medical organizations can learn a lot from the military because they're really good at getting untrained people to do things they need to do in a short amount of time. And it's the equivalent of like, it's like recruiting. If you take like an SEC football program, they have, or the NFL, right? Like the NFL has tape on what players can do. So they don't need to haze them to identify who's a good football player and who's not. Like you don't need to have receivers run 300-yard shuttles over and over again at the NFL Combine to know who can play and who can't, because you've already like seen them play. So then, I mean, we could argue about whether the Combine could be better or not, but like,
Well, they're going to have to rethink that now because they can't do it. Right? It's going to be really interesting this year, Doug, because I don't think they can bring people together for the combine over the next month or
oh,
so.
is that right?
Yeah, I think there might be a decision rendered in the next week or so what's going to happen. So maybe you're right. Maybe hey, we got game film and note from their doctor. Maybe that's it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, with the military, like I said, you're taking people who haven't done the job you want them to do. So before you're going to invest money into training them, you have to find these imperfect proxies to determine if somebody is trainable. Once they're deemed trainable, like people who've all seen like the Navy SEAL documentaries where they crawl through sand and walk around with boats over their head and stay in freezing cold water, like once they're qualified, but before like a Navy SEAL, team goes to Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever in the world they are now, like as part of their training, they don't run around with boats on their head and crawl through cold water. They practice their job, right? So in sports, we already have that. We already have watched people do their job. But you're right. Like with the combine, it's going to be scary, I think, for the NFL because if there's no combine this year, it's not going to change a damn thing. It's not like teams are going to be like, well, what do we do now?
What do we do now?
It's almost going to make it like, wow, we never really needed that. But the combine is also a business, so you don't want the combine to be obsolete because it makes football relevant in March or February or April, whenever they do it, right? But I mean, do you think like I would argue that if a team really needs like someone's 40, if that's going to make or break their draft decision, they probably don't know what they're doing. I mean, like probably with the 40, it's like you have a threshold where if it's a receiver or a skill player, they need to be fast enough. But if you have somebody that just like does everything you want on film and has all the right technical and tactical abilities, if they run a 4.4 or a 4.5, does that like really matter that much? Like probably not. I think there's that threshold. I think that you could probably see that speed on film as well. So yeah, it's going to be interesting if there is no combine this year, because then what happens next year when presumably people can convene in person? Do you still like have the combine when it's deemed to be not that important? Like the linebacker drills where the guy's pointing and they're running around. Like, are teams getting something out of that? I don't know. Maybe they are.
I have no clue either. But certainly the way I've heard like the whole pandemic described is it's like an accelerator of things that probably are going to happen.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at what you do as an educator and somebody who's out there as a thought leader in your profession, what are some of the things that you're going to change? What has been accelerated in the last 10 months that you're kind of going to move on moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely doing more the digital education, because I think number one, it's more scalable, and outside of like a hands-on internship, I think that I always look at like, and this is not just me, but I think anybody should ask like, what kind of value are you really providing? Like, does the price point of an in-person course is just so much higher? And even forgetting the price point of the course itself, like most courses require travel. So you have to fly somewhere, stay in a hotel. I mean, for even if a course costs like $300 for the weekend, a lot of times like you might have to spend $1,000 just to go to the course, and that provides no educational value. Like yes, you get to hang out with your friends in the hotel, and there is something to that because a lot of times like the best learning is what goes on at night at the bar, at the social, or at dinner. Um, so I don't think that should be totally replaced, but especially if a course is mainly theoretical, like there's no reason why it shouldn't be digital at this point. And then, like you said, try to save the in person component to like what is where does in person provide a truly like unique learning opportunity that you can't digitize. And so that's where where we want to go and probably where you want to go, and I think where kind of most people are going because I think if you value people's time and money, that's what you should be doing. And even from like if your goal is to scale your business, digital education is much more scalable than in person. Like even if we had the following where people wanted to go to our courses every weekend, like I personally would not want to have to travel to a course every weekend if I didn't have to, because that's time away from your family and stuff like that. So I think that's where it's going, and saving the true mentorship for okay, like I think if you're going to mentor somebody, it should be show me like what you do with this person. So if it's physical therapy, you're going to learn the most by like just watching somebody treat without that person even explaining what they do, because you can theorize about like what you would do in a certain situation, but I always say like show people your portfolio. If you're kind of if you're like a professional investor, it's one thing to tell somebody else how to invest their money, and yes, like everyone's kind of different, but nothing is more telling than that investor just showing somebody else their own personal portfolio. That tells you what you believe in. Like I could tell you on Twitter what I think, what I believe in terms of like theory and abstract things about rehabilitation. But if you come and watch me treat somebody, there's nothing more real than that. There's no BSing like what somebody believes in if you're actually watching them do it. It's like these circular debates on social media when it comes to coaching. It's like, do you use internal cues, external cues? Do you do part training or whole training? Do you do drills? Like, none of that means anything on Twitter. It's like, go watch somebody coach, because I guarantee you that most coaches do some form of drills. It's not all they do. Like, no good coach does only drills, but no good coach just says, okay, like you're warmed up, we're just going to do block starts, and like that's all we're going to do, and we're just going to do block start 40s and sprints. Like there's always going to be a teaching component, and you're going to take the whole skill, you're going to look at it, you're going to break it down into its components, you're going to do a drill or something, a slowed down version of an actual sprint to get somebody to hit a position that you want. Then you're going to have them do the whole sprint again. It's this constant tinkering back and forth. And that's what learning and coaching is. And so that can never be replaced, I don't think, by digitizing it. But you can teach somebody about like what are the key sprint positions online. I can teach somebody like here are the mobility drills that I like for somebody's hips. But as far as like how do I determine when somebody I think needs that, and then how do I progress them, like that's where kind of the art comes in. And that's where I think internship and mentorship have a role. But I think a lot of what's traditionally done can definitely be digitized.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, what I want to ask you too was, what are some of the things that you guys are offering right now in terms of resilient and some of the online stuff and resources, and what are some things that you have planned so that people can check into that?
Yes, so far we have it's called like the Movement Foundations course, which I think is basically just kind of like a broad overview of how to, from like a rehab to a performance setting, kind of progress exercise. So it's a little bit more like you kind of start with like more mobility centric drills and then progress to strength drills. And then we get a little bit into like how do you program that and some case studies. A very, very superficial bit about like running mechanics and stuff like that. But it's definitely not, that's not the emphasis. It's really more on like, I would say if it's a physio, it's more like here's a foundational therapeutic exercise course. And then if it's a more performance person, like here's how to kind of, from an exercise standpoint, like look at the entire spectrum between, kind of acute, somebody's lacking foundational positions, and then how to progress that and load that with strength and power exercises, and even some like basic plyo things. It's kind of more of like a foundational course, not so specific. And then in the next, hopefully, like couple of months, we're going to release a change of direction return to sport course that Trevor did. And that's going to be, like if you have someone that's coming off, say, like an ACL surgery, like how do you start once somebody has the strength base and the mobility base? What are the progressions you would start with from like a change of direction, acceleration standpoint? And then how do you make that more chaotic? So, and that's where some of these like circular debates become, seem kind of stupid, because like, yeah, I mean, you can even argue in a healthy athlete, like should healthy athletes be doing fixed change of direction drills, or just these like ecological, perceptual tag and agility drills? But in a healthy athlete, you can have that debate, but in rehab, like it's not a debate. Like you're not going to take somebody who's 3 months status post ACL surgery and have them go play tag with somebody and have them do these very, very like complex cognitive, type of change of direction scenarios or agility scenarios. That's where you might start with like a very, very, like a fixed drill where it's like you put a band around somebody, have them do like a resisted slide, where it's actually more like a specific strength drill, not so much a change of direction or agility drill. And then you can progress that until ultimately you're doing things that are more chaotic. But I think that when you look at things from like a rehab standpoint, it shows that everything has a place, because if you're trying to load specific tissues and specific positions, unless you're constraining the drill where the person has no choice but to get in that position, then it shows the futility of doing like a more complex agility drill. Because if someone is injured and you don't actually like have them hit certain positions and load those positions, then in the return to sport scenario where you're doing these like chaotic, agility drills or scenarios, people can work around the tissue that was never loaded. So that's why you see a lot of athletes who like if they don't get their quad strength back, and then when they go and sprint, they they aren't able to like, they don't have the same stiffness in the stance leg. A lot of times they'll they might not feel comfortable like getting any knee flexion in a change of direction scenario, because when they load that leg, they never got that quad strength. They never actually worked on foundational positions. So now when they do the chaotic drill, they use more like a hip or an ankle strategy. They don't load their knee. So in rehab, you kind of have to go through more of a progression. But that same progression, I think, can actually be used in healthy athletes in the off season, where if you have someone that's like, coming off an NFL season and they sat on the couch for 6 weeks, like day one, are you really going to have them do 7-on-7s or have them do these chaotic agility drills? Like, I think it still makes more sense to use the kind of fixed change of direction drills first and then progress. And I'm not saying you can't do both at the same time. In a healthy athlete, you can do tag and small sided games, but you can also do more constrained drills that sort of emphasize certain positions and tissues that you want to stress. And so that's kind of what the change of direction and return to sport course is going to emphasize, is like, how do you take, somebody from square one and then progress them to doing all the things that you'd want to see from a change of direction standpoint on the field. So that should be coming available hopefully in the next couple of weeks, couple of months. And then from there, I mean, it's just, like our resources are more based on like, if we had a student that came in, what would we want them to know before they started working with us? And so we're probably just going to keep building on that. Like at some point, I would like to do more of like a running centric course where it covers like distance running, sprinting with more of like a rehab emphasis, and maybe even collaborate with someone like you on that. Because I think that when it comes to like, sport oriented physical therapists or strength coaches that work with injured athletes, I think you need to have like a therapeutic exercise base and an exercise progression that you use. You have to have a change of direction base and a running base. And then if you have those three things, I think you've hit on you've hit on the key components, and you can get very, very specific and like kind of dialed in after that. But, I think that like even in my field of physio, a lot of what I've seen from like a sport, the formal curriculum for like sport physical therapists, again, it tends to be very, very heavy on theory, but like I haven't seen many physios talking about like, what does change of direction progressions actually look like in practice? Everybody will say it's important to progressively work up to, game-like scenarios, but no one's really showing like, what does that actually look like you know, from like a programming standpoint, or what do those drills look like in practice? And then same thing with running. It's like now everyone's saying, okay, like yes, sprinting is important, but how do you take an injured athlete and get them to go from a hamstring strain acutely to sprinting? You're doing that, and like that's why we've learned a lot from you in this area. But a lot of times, in the physio community, it's really like there's not much of an emphasis on mechanics. I think that physio for a while was like, because mechanical explanations of pain were all everybody ever did, there's been a backlash against it. So the running progression in physio tends to be like, hey, your hamstring is injured. We'll do some like specific hamstring strengthening, some bridges, some Nordics, and then we'll put you on the Alter G, and then we'll gradually build you back up to running. But no one's talking about like, well, what positions are going to make you safer to run at max velocity in the first place? And again, there's a bandwidth and a range there, but I think people have kind of like are starting to abandon mechanical models because they're imperfect and they're incomplete. But it's funny. I see like a lot of track and field coaches talking about the importance of mechanics and sprinting and running, and yet the physios are saying that it doesn't matter. That's all about progressive overload and gradual loading. And it's like, me personally, I would trust the people who they make their livelihood based on getting people to run faster. And again, it's not purely about like injury. There's a performance component to it. But even if you say, okay, like there's no perfect way to run from an injury standpoint, you do see people that are fast tend to do, there's some commonalities among like what track and field sprinters are doing. And so I don't think it's crazy to take a team sport athlete and say, hey, what can we learn from the track and field model, even though it's not 100% carryover to what they do on the field. I think that, if you have like a running back or a receiver in football, if they break away and they're in the open field, and the best way for them to create separation is to run linearly, I think that's a really good place to apply that track and field model. And, people often say, oh, well, like team sport athletes, all they do is accelerate. So max velocity doesn't matter. But if you have a team sport athlete and they have created some separation because they do accelerate well, and now they're in the open field, when they are, not evading anybody or they're not expecting contact and they're still running, like they're accelerating, well, they're actually leaving potential on the table because now they could be not producing, same degree of vertical forces. They might not, because they're going to be running with more of a muscular strategy and a less elastic strategy. They're not going to reach the same speeds. So I think that like all this stuff has a place. And I think from a physio standpoint, like there's people talk about how, running is really more of a load management issue, even with distance runners. Like, hey, just, if you've got a tendinopathy, as long as you back off on the loading, do some isometrics and then gradually increase your mileage, you should be fine. And I'm not saying that like every athlete you work with should warrant a mechanical change, but if you aren't even looking at it, I think that's kind of irresponsible. And that's where the art comes in. Like, how do you know when to do it and not do it? Especially if you have someone who's really fast and they have like what you consider a mechanical or technical anomaly, do you always want to change it? Of course not. But if you don't look at it and you don't know what the model is of movement to change it if you had to or you wanted to, then I think a lot of times people they're saying it's not important because they don't know how to do it. And so our goal is kind of like, how do we take, that sports oriented physio and give them just through the basic courses, like what they would need to have that like 80% to be successful. And then the rest of it's going to be, consulting with mentors and watching people treat and then just getting experience. But I think there's a lot of potential left to be had when it comes to physio, and even because it is a spectrum with some overlap. And then even like the strength coaches and sport coaches who, they're working with the athlete that's 4 months post ACL, where it's not like, the first week where they have no range of motion, but they're not fully ready to be back. In that gray area where do they work with a physio or a sport coach or a strength coach, getting those athletes to understand what progressions look like and what things an athlete should be able to do before you're having them go back and practice and run full speed and play in scrimmages and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I encourage everybody to kind of check out your stuff and follow, where you take that, because I know you guys do a really good job and you're very thorough about it, about the nuances and all that. So what's the best way to find out more about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, our website is resilientperformance.com. We've got like a mailing list on there. So that's kind of the best way to learn about the things that are, like up and coming courses and educational resources. Our Instagram is really just videos of what we actually do, like in training. We try to protect athletes' privacy, so it's mainly stuff we do with athletes, but we're doing it ourselves, just to be like HIPAA compliant and stuff like that. But so our Instagram is just resilient PPT, for resilient performance physical therapy. We have a resilient Twitter, and then my Twitter is Green Feet PT. I'm probably like the most personally active on Twitter. But then, anything that like any content that I contribute to my partners will go on the communal resilient accounts, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, and then the mailing list as well.
That's great, and I'm looking forward to your TikTok account, Doug. So,
It's propaganda, man. Yeah.
well, thanks for taking the time, and yeah, I love your perspective on where all this is going, and I look forward to seeing what you guys do with it, because I'm taking notes too, and we're always constantly exchanging ideas. So, thank you again.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, like I would say that I would encourage anybody to look at, a multitude of resources, not just ours. Like where we came up with this stuff was by learning from a lot of people, including you. But I still would encourage anyone to go to the original sources. So like we're going to talk about running in some of our things, but there's way more qualified people to talk about running than us, including you. So just like I want there to be, a free market, like in university education, we encourage other people to seek out other resources, and like ultimately there's no better person to determine what's right for you than yourself, because only you work in your own setting. So just it's like the whole Bruce Lee thing, like study all the martial arts and then figure out what's good for your setting and disregard the rest. And we're just we're trying to do our part, but we're not the arbiters of good training and good information, and a lot of things people might disagree with, and like we're totally okay with that. We're just trying to like have the conversation and recognize like what we're doing is imperfect, but we try to be transparent and show like here's what we actually do, for better or for worse, and hopefully other people do that too, and then we can have that conversation.
Yeah, that's great. I completely agree with that philosophy, and I'm working every day to keep, trying to get exposure to people like yourselves and others, so that people can have a gallery of people to follow and learn from. So, thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you.